My family always treated me like an inconvenience, a stain on their perfect wealthy image. My father, a respected wealth manager, ruled our lives with an iron fist, and my mother and brother were his willing accomplices. When I got engaged to a man they couldn't control, my father tried to lock me into a brutal prenuptial agreement. He thought I would just roll over like I always had. He was wrong. He pushed me one step too far, and I decided it was time for the world to see the man behind the mask. This is not just a revenge story. No, it's a deep dive into a web of deceit, a complex financial crime investigation, and the ultimate act of reclaiming my power from a narcissistic family. This is the story of how I took back my life. If you enjoyed this video or found it helpful, go ahead and give it a like. It really helps me out. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any future videos. Thanks a bunch! The air in the private dining room of L'Etoile was as thick and heavy as the damask curtains that muted the sounds of downtown Boston. It was supposed to be a celebration, my engagement dinner. But sitting across from my father, Richard Sterling, felt less like a party and more like a deposition. He swirled the deep red Cabernet in his glass, the massive custom-engraved signet ring on his pinky catching the light of the crystal chandelier. The ring was a symbol of everything our family stood for: legacy, power, and an image so polished it blinded you to the rot underneath. "Elara," he began, his voice a low, smooth baritone that had charmed fortunes out of half of New England's old money. "And your mother and I are, of course, thrilled for you and Liam." He gestured vaguely at my fiancé, who sat beside me, his hand a warm, grounding presence on my knee. Liam was everything my family wasn't: kind, self-made, and utterly unimpressed by the Sterling name. My mother, Eleanor, offered a tight, rehearsed smile. "Absolutely thrilled, darling. A wedding is just what this family needs." Her eyes, however, darted nervously between my father and me, a silent plea for me to play my part, to not disrupt the carefully constructed harmony of the evening. My older brother, Julian, the golden boy, the heir apparent to Sterling Wealth Management, smirked into his glass. "Just try not to make it a spectacle, Lara. We have a reputation to maintain." There it was. The family mantra. Reputation. It was the god we all worshipped at the altar of our sprawling Wellesley home, a 10,000-square-foot temple of beige tones and hollow echoes. Growing up, I was the resident heretic. Julian could do no wrong. He was the star athlete, the Ivy League legacy, the charming prodigy who joined my father's firm right out of Wharton. I, on the other hand, was the quiet, awkward daughter who preferred data sets to debutante balls. I chose a state school for my master's in forensic accounting, a profession my father deemed unseemly and beneath us. I wasn't an asset to the Sterling brand. I was a potential liability, a loose thread in the family tapestry. My entire childhood was a masterclass in psychological warfare. I didn't have the language for it at the time. If I was upset about Julian breaking a treasured possession, I was being overly emotional. If I questioned my father's cold dismissal of my achievements, I was ungrateful. My mother was the chief enabler, the gentle gaslighter. "Oh, Elara, you're misunderstanding him," she'd say, her hand patting mine with a tenderness that felt like a trap. "Your father just has high standards. He wants you to be your best self." Their version of my best self was a quieter, more compliant version of my mother. A pretty accessory that didn't ask questions. Now my father placed his glass down with a decisive click. "We've been thinking," he said, the royal "we" hanging in the air. "This wedding should be an event, a true Sterling event. We'll host it at the country club. I'll handle the guest list. It's a perfect opportunity to solidify some relationships with my clients. We'll spare no expense." I felt a cold dread snake its way up my spine. This wasn't an offer, it was a takeover. "Dad, that's very generous," I started, choosing my words carefully. But Liam and I were thinking of something smaller, more intimate, maybe at that vineyard outside the city. Richard's eyes went flat and cold. It was a look I knew well, a silent power move that could curdle milk. "A vineyard? Elara, don't be ridiculous. That's for common people. This is the first Sterling wedding in a generation. It needs to reflect our standing. It will be at the club." "With all due respect, sir," Liam interjected, his voice calm but firm. "This is our wedding. We appreciate the offer, but we want it to reflect us." My father's gaze shifted to Liam, and for a moment I saw the predator behind the patriarch. He saw Liam not as his daughter's partner, but as an unforeseen variable, an element he couldn't control. "Of course, son," he said, the word son dripping with condescension. "We just want to help, to provide for you both." Which brings me to my next point. Slid a thick leather-bound folder across the table. It landed in front of me with a soft final thud. "What's this?" I asked, though I already knew. The dread in my stomach was now a block of ice. "A prenuptial agreement," Richard stated as if discussing the weather. "Standard procedure. It's for your protection, Alara, to ensure your future is secure, that the assets you'll one day inherit are properly managed." My mother nodded eagerly. "It's just a formality, darling. Everyone does it." My hands were trembling as I opened the folder. It wasn't a standard prenup. I was a forensic accountant. I knew how to read the fine print. This document was a cage. It gave my father sweeping control over any gifted assets, which included the house he'd give us and the trust I was supposed to inherit. It stipulated that any joint investments had to be managed exclusively through Sterling Wealth Management. There was even a lifestyle clause, an archaic piece of legal trash that essentially gave him a say in our major life decisions. It wasn't for my protection, it was for his control. It was a leash. I looked at Liam. His jaw was tight, his eyes flashing with a protective fire I'd never seen before. He had built his own successful software company from nothing. He didn't need or want a cent of my family's money. He wanted me. "No," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Richard's eyebrows shot up. "I'm sorry?" I took a deep breath, drawing strength from Liam's hand on my knee. Julian let out a short, derisive laugh. "Oh, for God's sake, Alara, don't be a martyr. Dad is handing you a life of luxury on a silver platter, and you're going to throw a tantrum over some paperwork?" "This isn't paperwork, Julian," I said, my voice gaining strength. "It's an insult. It assumes my fiancée is a gold digger, and that I'm an idiot who can't manage her own life." "Well, Julian began with a smirk, but my father cut him off with a sharp look. Richard's facade of benevolent patriarch crumbled, revealing the cold, hard narcissist beneath. "And you are being naive, Alara. This world eats people like you for breakfast. I have built an empire to protect this family, and you will not jeopardize it with your sentimental nonsense. You will have the wedding I've planned, and you will sign that document. If you don't, then you can consider your access to this family and its resources completely severed. You'll be on your own." The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. It was the same threat he'd used my whole life. Conform, or be cast out. Be a good girl, or be nothing. For years I had lived in a state of learned helplessness, believing I was powerless against him. I had developed a trauma bond with them, confusing their conditional, controlling love for the real thing. I'd chase their approval, bend myself into knots to receive a crumb of affection, only to be met with another impossible hoop to jump through. My mind was a battlefield of cognitive dissonance. They love me. They're my family fighting against. They hurt me. They don't respect me. But looking at Liam, who was looking at me with nothing but love and trust, something inside me finally snapped. It was the quiet, seismic shift of a tectonic plate, the final boundary being drawn. I slowly, deliberately closed the leather folder. I pushed it back across the table. "Sen, I guess we're on our own," I said, my voice clear and steady. "And we'll be having a small ceremony at the vineyard. You're welcome to come if you can manage to behave. But your money and your control are not welcome." I stood up and Liam stood with me. The shock on my family's faces was a masterpiece of disbelief. My mother's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with horror. Julian looked genuinely stunned, as if his pet rock had just recited Shakespeare. But my father's face was a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. His perfect world had been challenged. His authority had been defied. "You will regret this, Alara," he hissed, his voice dangerously low. "And you have no idea what you've just done." "No, Dad," I said, looking him directly in the eye for what felt like the first time in my life. "I think for the first time I do." We walked out of that restaurant and into the cool Boston night, leaving the Sterling family to simmer in their own gilded poison. I felt a terrifying, exhilarating sense of freedom. My father's threat wasn't a punishment. It was a promise of a life without him. But as we got into the cab, his words echoed in my mind, "You have no idea what you've just done." He was right. I had no idea. I had just declared war, and I had a sinking feeling that to win it, I'd have to burn his entire empire to the ground. The weeks that followed were a cold war of silence. My parents didn't call. Julian sent a single text. "You're a fool." I'd blocked his number. My mother-in-law-to-be, a wonderfully warm woman named Carol, stepped in and helped Liam and me plan the wedding we actually wanted. It was small, personal, and blessedly free of my father's overbearing influence. But a part of me couldn't let go. My father's power was absolute, his influence far-reaching. He had cast me out, but I still felt like I was in his shadow. I kept thinking about his firm's sterling wealth management, the impenetrable fortress from which he ruled his world. I thought about the whispers I'd heard over the years, the hushed conversations I wasn't supposed to overhear. I remembered a name, Arthur Vance. Arthur had been my father's original partner. They built the company together from the ground up. He was a brilliant, kind man who always had a smile for me when I was a kid. Then, one day, when I was about 15, he was just gone. The official story was that Arthur had made a series of reckless, unethical trades, nearly bankrupting the firm. My father, the hero, had discovered it just in time, fired Arthur, and saved the company and all its clients. Arthur Vance became a cautionary tale in our house, a ghost invoked to remind us of the price of failure and disloyalty. But I remembered the look in Arthur's eyes the last time I saw him, leaving my father's office with a cardboard box. It wasn't the look of a guilty man. It was the look of a man who had been profoundly and utterly betrayed. My father had threatened to destroy my future. What if the key to my freedom lay in destroying his past? My forensic accounting brain, the part of me my father so despised, kicked into high gear. It was a long shot, a crazy, desperate idea born of hurt and anger, but it was also logical. A narcissist like my father, obsessed with image and control, would have a pristine, perfect public narrative. Any cracks in that narrative would be his greatest vulnerability. Arthur Vance was a crack. It took me 2 weeks of deep diving through public records and old social media profiles to find him. He was living a quiet life in a small town in Vermont, a world away from the Shark Tank of Boston finance. He ran a small bookstore. One crisp autumn Saturday, I drove the 3 hours north. I found the bookstore, a charming place called The Last Word, tucked away on a cobblestone street. An old-fashioned bell chimed as I walked in. And there he was, behind the counter, older, grayer, with lines of sadness etched around his eyes, but unmistakably Arthur. He looked up, and for a fleeting second, I saw a flicker of recognition, followed by a guarded, weary caution. "Hello, Lara," he said, his voice raspy. "So Lara Sterling." "Hello, Arthur," I said, my heart pounding in my chest. "I know it's been a long time, but I think you and I need to talk. I think my father ruined your life, and now I want you to help me ruin his. If you enjoyed this video or found it helpful, go ahead and give it a like. It really helps me out. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss any future videos. Thanks a bunch." Arthur stared at me for a long moment, his face a canvas of conflicting emotions. Suspicion, pain, curiosity, and a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. The cozy smell of old paper and brewing coffee in his bookstore felt like a sanctuary, a world away from the sterile, high-stakes environment where my father had destroyed him. "Ruin him," Arthur finally said, his voice low. "Child, you have no idea what you're talking about. Your father is not a man you cross. He's a king in his own kingdom. I learned that the hard way. I'm beginning to understand that," I said, stepping closer to the counter. "He tried to control my marriage. He threatened to disown me when I refused. He told me I'd be nothing without him. It's the same thing he did to you, isn't it? He didn't just fire you. He destroyed your reputation. He made you the villain so he could be the hero." She looked away, his gaze falling on a stack of worn-out poetry books. "He told everyone I was a reckless trader, that I'd put client funds at risk with unauthorized investments. He produced paperwork, trade confirmations. It was all there in black and white. The board sided with him. The SEC investigated, and while they never charged me, my name was mud. No one in finance would touch me. He took everything. My career, my savings, my name. Was any of it true? I asked softly. He finally met my eyes, and I saw a flicker of the old fire I remembered from my childhood. No, none of it. Richard was the one taking the risks. He was running a shadow ledger, a separate set of books for a handful of special clients. He was promising impossible returns, using new investor money to pay off the old ones. It was a classic Ponzi, small scale back then, but it was there. I found out. I confronted him. I told him we had to go to the authorities to make it right. I was naive. I thought he had a conscience. Arthur let out a bitter laugh. The next day, he called an emergency board meeting. He presented them with a file full of fabricated evidence pointing to me. He'd been planning it for months. He'd used my login, forged my signature on trade orders. He didn't just push me out. He framed me to cover his own crimes. He gaslit the entire board, the entire financial community. And I had no proof. It was his word against the mountain of lies he'd built. My blood ran cold. It was so much worse than I had imagined. My father hadn't just been unethical. He was a dedicated, meticulous criminal. The same manipulative, narcissistic patterns he used to control his family, he used to defraud his clients. In line, he's still doing it, isn't he? I said. The pieces clicking into place. The firm's returns are too good to be true. They've consistently outperformed the market even in downturns for 15 years. It's statistically improbable. He never stopped. He just got better at hiding it. Arthur nodded slowly. I've always suspected. But what can I do? I'm a disgraced bookseller in Vermont. He's Richard Sterling. Ain't you have the knowledge? I countered, my mind racing. You know how he thinks, how he operates. And I have the skills. I'm a forensic accountant, Arthur. It's what I do. I can find the patterns, trace the money. He thinks I'm just his disappointing, emotional daughter. He would never in a million years suspect me. We can do this, together, and dine. For the first time, a glimmer of hope sparked in Arthur's tired eyes. He looked at me, really looked at me, and saw not just Richard Sterling's daughter, but an ally, an instrument of a justice long denied. All right, Alara, he said, a new resolve hardening his voice. All right, let's burn his kingdom down. For the next 2 months, my life became a series of secret meetings and clandestine operations. I told Liam everything. He was horrified but unwavering in his support. He helped me set up encrypted hard drives and secure communication channels. By day, I was the bride-to-be, tasting cakes and finalizing flower arrangements. By night, Arthur and I were a 2-person investigative team, huddled over laptops in his small apartment above the bookstore. Arthur was the key. He remembered the names of the original special clients, the ones my father was paying off. He knew the offshore shell corporations Richard favored, the obscure banks in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland he used to layer transactions. With his institutional knowledge and my modern data analysis techniques, we began to build a map of my father's fraud. It was a work of dark genius. He had multiple LLCs, each feeding into the next, making the money almost impossible to trace. He was using the firm's main legitimate fund as a cover, siphoning off a small percentage from thousands of clients, amounts too small for any single person to notice, and funneling it into the Ponzi scheme to pay the massive guaranteed returns he'd promised his high-value, secret investors. These investors were a who's who of powerful, and in some cases, unsavory figures. People who wouldn't ask too many questions as long as the money kept flowing. The most sickening discovery came when I cross-referenced the timelines with my family's history. A huge, inexplicable influx of cash into one of the shell corporations coincided perfectly with the year Julian crashed his new Porsche and was facing a massive lawsuit. Another coincided with the year my parents bought their summer home in Nantucket. My father wasn't just running a fraud, he was using the stolen money to fund our entire luxurious lifestyle. The Wellesley house, the designer clothes, Julian's Ivy League education, the signet ring on my father's finger. It was all built on a foundation of lies and theft. And then we found the twist, the final devastating piece of the puzzle. I was analyzing the initial seed money for the very first shell corporation, the one that started it all. The transaction was sloppy, not at all like my father's meticulous work. It was desperate. Arthur and I dug deeper, pulling old bank records. The money hadn't come from my father. It had come from an account belonging to my brother Julian. He had accrued massive gambling debts in college. He'd started the initial fraud, a clumsy, amateurish attempt to use client funds to cover his losses. He'd been caught by my father, but instead of punishing him, instead of upholding the law, Richard had seen an opportunity. He took Julian's pathetic little crime, refined it, scaled it up, and turned it into an empire. He hadn't just enabled his golden child, he had become his co-conspirator. The entire sterling fortune, the source of all my family's pride and power, was rotten from the very core, started by the son he adored and perfected by the father who preached integrity. We had it. We had everything. Encrypted files containing bank statements, shell corporation ownership documents, and a detailed flowchart that connected every fraudulent transaction directly to my father and brother. It was irrefutable. Now, we needed a plan. We could just go to the SEC, but that felt too quiet, too clean. My father's god was his reputation. His punishment had to be public. It had to be a spectacle. A true sterling event. My wedding day arrived. It was a perfect, crisp New England autumn day. The vineyard was stunning, a kaleidoscope of red and gold leaves. As I put on my dress, a simple, elegant gown that I had chosen, I felt a strange sense of calm. This day wasn't just about my marriage to Liam. It was about my divorce from the life I was supposed to have. My family arrived as I knew they would. They couldn't stand the thought of being absent, of not being the center of attention. My mother wore a pained, martyred expression. Julian looked bored and superior. My father surveyed the modest gathering with a look of undisguised contempt. He cornered me as I was about to walk down the aisle. "This is a pathetic display, Alara," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You've embarrassed this family, but don't worry. When this little charade of a marriage inevitably fails, and you come crawling back, you'll find my door is locked." I just smiled. "Enjoy the party, Dad. I have a feeling it's going to be one for the history books." The ceremony was beautiful. Standing opposite Liam saying my vows, I felt a profound sense of peace. I was choosing my own family, my own future. The reception was held in a beautifully restored barn on the property. The atmosphere was joyful, filled with the laughter of our friends and Liam's wonderful family. My own family sat at a corner table like a thundercloud, refusing to speak to anyone. Then came the speeches. Liam's best man told a hilarious story. My maid of honor made everyone cry, and then my father stood up. He hadn't been asked to speak, but a narcissist can't resist a microphone. He walked to the center of the room, tapping his glass for attention. A hush fell over the crowd. "I am Richard Sterling," he began, his voice booming with false magnanimity. "Alara's father. While this rustic affair is not what I would have chosen for my daughter, a father must support his children's choices, no matter how misguided." He was about to launch into a self-serving monologue about family and legacy. But he never got the chance. At exactly 8:15 p.m., on a signal from me, Arthur, who was posing as a guest, hit send on an email. The subject line was, "An urgent message regarding Sterling Wealth Management." The email, sent from a secure anonymous address, went out to a very specific list. It included every single one of my father's clients, many of whom were in that very room, along with the enforcement division of the SEC, the FBI's white-collar crime unit, and the financial editors of the Wall Street Journal and the Boston Globe. The email contained a simple, chilling message. For years, Richard and Julian Sterling have been operating a sophisticated Ponzi scheme. Your investments are not safe. For irrefutable proof, please visit the link below. The link led to the secure website Arthur and I had built, containing every piece of evidence we had uncovered. The flowcharts, the bank statements, the shell corporations, the whole rotten truth. At first, nothing happened. My father continued his speech. Then, a single phone buzzed, then another, and another. A low murmur rippled through the room. Guests were pulling out their phones, their eyes widening in shock and horror. The festive atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a stunned, ice-cold silence. My father paused, confused by the sudden shift in the room. He saw his biggest client, a real estate tycoon, staring at his phone, his face pale as a sheet. "What is this?" Richard demanded, his voice faltering. My brother Julian had his phone out now, his face contorting in a mask of pure panic. He looked at me across the room, and in his eyes I saw dawning, terrified comprehension. He knew. My father followed his son's gaze to me. I just stood there, next to my husband, and held his stare. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just let him see. Let him understand that his pathetic emotional daughter, the liability, the black sheep, was the one who had brought down his entire kingdom. The look on his face was not anger. It was not hatred. It was the look of a god who had just realized he was mortal. The sound of his perfectly curated world shattering was not a loud explosion, but the quiet, horrified buzzing of 100 cell phones. Then, through the tall barn doors, 2 men in dark suits walked in, followed by several uniformed officers. They were calm, professional, and their eyes were locked on my father and brother. My father's carefully constructed mask of power and charisma dissolved into nothing. He looked old, and small, and utterly defeated. The king was naked in his crumbling castle. They escorted him and Julian out without a word. My mother collapsed into a sobbing heap. The party was over. Later that night, after the chaos had subsided and the guests had gone home, Liam and I stood on the porch of our hotel room, overlooking the quiet, moonlit vineyard. I should have felt triumphant. I should have felt the satisfaction of perfect revenge, but mostly, I just felt quiet, a profound, hollowed-out sense of peace. I had grieved the loss of my family long before that night. I was grieving for the father, mother, and brother I should have had. The family I had spent my entire life trying to earn the love of. Tonight wasn't about destroying them, it was about saving myself. The next morning, it was all over the news. Boston financial titan arrested in massive Ponzi scheme. The headlines were brutal. My father's name, his precious reputation, was not just mud, it was radioactive. In the months that followed, the full extent of the fraud came to light. Arthur was fully vindicated, and even received a substantial whistleblower reward from the SEC, which he used to expand his bookstore and set up a foundation for financial literacy. My father and brother were sentenced to decades in federal prison. My mother, left with nothing but a mountain of legal bills and social shame, moved to a small condo in Florida, refusing all my attempts to reach out. She had made her choice long ago. Liam and I built our life, a real life, based on trust and mutual respect. I opened my own forensic accounting firm, specializing in helping victims of financial fraud. I found my purpose not in destroying but in rebuilding. Sometimes late at night I think about that final look on my father's face. The utter incomprehension of a narcissist who could not conceive of a world that didn't revolve around him. He had spent his life building a fortress of lies to protect his ego, never realizing that the biggest threat wasn't a market crash or a federal investigation. It was the daughter he had underestimated, the one person who saw the rot behind the polished facade, and who finally found the courage to strike a match and light the whole thing on fire. He was right about one thing. I had no idea what I was doing when I walked out of that restaurant. I wasn't just starting a war, I was starting my life,